al-Assad stresses upon receiving a Turkish parliamentary delegation the need to separate between the stand of Turkish people and that of Erdogan government. The Foreign Ministry notifies the UN Security Council and the General Secretary of the Turkish involvement in supporting terrorists in Syria. Israeli espionage equipment has been discovered and confiscated near the Syrian coast. Good afternoon, I am Yarado Krikorian with the news in English. President Bashar al-Assad today received a Turkish parliamentary delegation representing the People's Republican Party headed by Hassan Akgouila. The talks centered on the situation in Syria. The members of the parliamentary delegation expressed the Turkish people's rejection of interference in the Syrian internal affairs and keenness on good neighborly relations. They warned against the dangerous repercussions of the Syrian crisis on Turkey in particular and regional states in general. On his part, President al-Assad stressed the need to separate between the stands of the Turkish people in support of stability in Syria and those of the Erdogan government that insist on supporting terrorism and extremism and shaking up stability in the area. The president affirmed that the Syrian people appreciate the stands of the Turkish people and parties that reject the Erdogan government's policies, which have their negative impact on the ethnic and religious diversification that distinguishes the societies in the region, particularly in Syria and Turkey. The Foreign and Expatriates Ministry has addressed two identical messages to the chairman of the UN Security Council and the UN Secretary General on the Turkish government's continued public declaration of its interference in Syria's internal affairs and its support of the terrorists in Syria. The ministry said field data and political and information reports, as well as the facts referred to by the Turkish parliamentarians and party's chairman, recently revealed the bulk of Turkish interference in the events in Syria. The ministry cited as examples the Turkish government's permission to 3 Saudi C-103 aircraft dedicated for military transportation and evacuation to use the Turkish airspace in order to deliver arms and equipment to the armed men in Syria. Turkey, the ministry added, has opened its airspace before the external use of foreign troops, and this proves that it has become a party to the war on Syria. Furthermore, one can add the statements made by some leaders of the armed terrorist groups to world news agencies and media about arms shipments that had arrived in Syria via Turkey last month that included shoulder-borne equipment, anti-aircraft weapons, armors and mortar and missile shells, and that they had received such weapons legally and normally, not through smuggled passages but officially through Bab al-Hawa borders cross-point with Turkey. The ministry added that such data prove that the Turkish territories have turned into a center for assembling, sheltering, exporting, supporting and financing terrorism and terrorists from Al-Qaeda organization to work inside Syria with the knowledge and supervision of the Turkish government. The Foreign and Expatriates Ministry said the international community's disregard of such compelling evidence about Turkey's involvement contributes to the continuation of the crisis and provides a cover to the Qaeda-linked armed terrorist groups and the states supporting them to continue their massacres against the Syrian people. The ministry voiced Syria's hope that the world community would shoulder its responsibilities and condemn Turkey's role and the country supporting terrorism and would hold them accountable for what is happening in Syria. The ministry called for earnest efforts to deal with this dangerous situation because such stands on the part of the world community would necessarily lead to the handling of the situation and would encourage the Syrian opposition sides to sit at the table of dialogue in order to solve the crisis. Lebanese Foreign and Expatriates Minister Adnan Mansour has said in a press conference at Beirut airport that there is no law at the UN or the Arab League that allows the interference of a state in the internal affairs of another state.
سياسة النأي بالنفس عن القرارات التي صدرت بحق سوريا، وهذا المبدأ لم نتخلى عنه حتى أمس.
Mansour added that the cycle of violence in Syria will only lead to violence, and the only way out of the crisis would not be through arms. He said Lebanon is not away from the repercussions of such situation, therefore war must be avoided. Mansour said there has been a systematic fuss about Lebanon's recent stand at the Arab League regarding the crisis in Syria. He pointed out
قلت في كلمتي ومداخلتي، وفي هذه الكلمة تناولت قضايا عديدة، قضية الشرق الأوسط وقضية فلسطين، وجعل منطقة الشرق الأوسط منطقة منزوعة من السلاح الشامل.
He pointed out that Lebanon is committed to the policy of self-alienation. This does not mean that other countries may interfere in our affairs, he affirmed. Mr. Adnan Mansour has stressed from Cairo that the Arab League's decisions on Syria legitimize the armament of the groups and set the doors wide open before the smuggling of weapons into the country. In reply to the criticism leveled against him because of his stance at the League, Mansour said Syria should return to the League so that a political solution can be reached. He added that his stance do not run counter to the Lebanese government's viewpoints and policy of self-alienation. He pointed out that his stance towards Syria are based on keenness on Lebanon.
فلنعد سوريا إلى حضن جامعتها العربية ولنرفع تعليق مشاركتها في اجتماعاتنا، فالتواصل مع سوريا لإنقاذها واحتضانها من جديد ضرورة من أجل الحل السياسي وهويته الوطنية. إن مسؤوليتنا كبيرة على أطراف المجتمع الدولي بالحقيقة، فالتواصل مع سوريا لإنقاذها واحتضانها من جديد ضرورة من أجل الحل السياسي.
The Russian President's special envoy to the Middle East, Mikhail Bogdanov, has discussed with the UN envoy to Syria, Al-Akhtar al-Ibrahimi, the issue of the immediate halt of violence and the beginning of a political solution to the crisis in Syria. The Russian Foreign Ministry said in a statement that emphasis was laid on the need of an urgent initiation of national dialogue with the participation of all sides on the basis of the Geneva Statement. An official source has said that the Israeli espionage system discovered last Friday off the Syrian shore was directed at a vital target with the intention of conveying images immediately to the Zionist entity through cameras prepared for this purpose through satellites. The source added today that the components of the espionage system were installed in a way that resembled the nature of the rocks in the area where the system was planted. It added that the components included a camera, antennas, 6 batteries and an electricity organizer, in addition to cables that connected the various main parts. The source noted that the presence of this espionage system at this time indicates the role of the Zionist enemy in the current events inside Syria at present, as the information that is conveyed is useful to the Zionist enemy and the armed groups inside the country. A military source has said an army unit targeted today a terrorist group that belonged to al-Nusra Front east of Jairud in Damascus suburbs. The operation resulted in eliminating all the members of the group and destroying their criminal tools. On the other hand, the citizens of Aqraba and Beit Saham in Damascus suburbs started returning to their homes after the Syrian Arab Army restored security and stability to the area. In Idlib countryside, our army units targeted terrorist gatherings in the towns of Binnesh, Majdalia and Nerab and Dehnin farms, inflicting upon them heavy losses. In the district of Wadi Daif in Ma'arrat al-Nu'man, a qualitative operation was conducted by the army during which a number of terrorists were killed, including Sulaiman al-Hawat, Muhammad Abdul Karim al-Aqla, Hussein Maher Mashhoum, Abdullah Nader Mashhoum, Mustafa Ghirer, Abdullah Mashhour al-Isa, Tahir al-Isa, Nidar Abdullah al-Isa, Saeed Abdul Razak Swerim, and Mu'taz Abdul Hafiz. Another army unit destroyed 120mm artillery cannon and eliminated a number of terrorists in Hish town, including Hussein Ibrahim, Muhsin Ibrahim, and Abdul Razak Ibrahim, who are affiliated to so-called At-Tawheed Battalion. Our armed forces regained control of a large section of Khan al-Assad area of Aleppo after eliminating large numbers of terrorists. Photos taken from the scene showed widespread destruction, including a cables warehouse destroyed by the terrorist groups. Material damage was estimated at 1 billion Syrian pounds. Meanwhile, clashes continued between our army units and the armed terrorist groups in the area surrounding Khan al-Assad. In a new evidence about the involvement of some Western countries in the events in Syria in cooperation with other regional and Arab states, the Swedish newspaper The Local revealed that military and logistic support has been given to armed terrorist groups in Syria who are committing the most horrible crimes against innocent civilians. The Swedish news agency broadcast a report which shows an armed terrorist carrying on his shoulder an anti-armored Carl Gustav rocket made in Sweden. A military expert confirmed that the new weapon is very effective and very easy to use. Several military strategists pointed out that Sweden had sold Carl Gustav rockets to 40 different countries in the world, raising many doubts about the government's control of its weapons sales in the world, especially the countries like Qatar and Saudi Arabia, which provide terrorists in Syria with military aid. Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Gennady Gatilov condemned the terrorist act of detaining members of UNDOF mission which observed ceasefire along the borders with Israel. Gatilov pointed out that the terrorist act shows a total disrespect of the United Nations. He asserted that the terrorists spare no effort to violate all human norms and conventions, and the whole world must condemn such an act. For its part, China condemned the kidnapping of UNDOF members in the Syrian-occupied Golan and called for their immediate release. The spokesman for the Chinese Foreign Ministry, Hua Chunying, that China demands that the terrorists set free all the kidnapped UN employees without any prior condition, adding that China urges all concerned parties to take effective measures in order to protect all UN missions operating there. Back to our local news, and within the framework of preparing for the national dialogue, a workshop was held yesterday amongst several political figures at Kafar Sousek Cultural Center in Damascus.
The meeting was led by the political researcher Abdullah Mnini, and it was also attended by the Member of Parliament Khalid Al-Aboud, the head of the newly established Tadammun Party Salim Al-Kharrat, and other prominent personalities.
I think that this symposium is much needed. This is the first step in starting a comprehensive dialogue between a wide range of the Syrian society and other establishments. There are 3 points in the meeting today. 1, the discussions are open between us and the guests. 2, we support the comprehensive dialogue. And 3, the Syrian people want to build a future and refuse any foreign intervention.
The talks that were held tackled ways of starting the dialogue and the role of the newly established parties, and that this must be free and national with no links to any race or religion.
I think that the Syrians are exceptionally supported at this very important political and historical juncture, as we are starting to understand the culture of dialogue, and this is the first step in the right direction.
The delegation asserted that the suitable guarantees should be given to those who put their weapons aside and come to participate in the dialogue in order to encourage the others to put their weapons aside. The delegation's members added that the weapons should be in the hands of the Syrian Arab Army only, affirming that the random spread of the arms should be halted directly.
With this, we end our news for today. Thank you for watching. For more news about Syria and the region and to view this bulletin again, you can always visit our website in English, syriaonline.sy. Now to latest business and market news with Khalid Saqabani after a short break. Korean with the news in English. President Bashar al-Assad today received a Turkish parliamentary delegation representing the People's Republican Party headed by Hassan Akgul. The talks centered on the situation in Syria. The members of the parliamentary delegation expressed the Turkish people's rejection of interference in the Syrian internal affairs and keenness on good neighborly relations. They warned against the dangerous repercussions of the Syrian crisis on Turkey in particular and regional states in general. On his part, President al-Assad stressed the need to separate between the stands of the Turkish people. Israeli espionage equipment has been discovered and confiscated near the Syrian coast. Good afternoon, I am Yara. In support of stability in Syria and those of the Erdogan government that insist on supporting terrorism and extremism and shaking up stability in the area. The president affirmed that the Syrian people appreciate the stance of the Turkish people and parties that reject the Erdogan government's policies, which have their negative impact on the ethnic and religious diversification that distinguishes the societies in the region, particularly in Syria and Turkey. The Foreign and Expatriates Ministry has addressed two identical messages to the Chairman of the UN Security Council and the UN Secretary General on the Turkish government's continued public declaration of its interference in Syria's internal affairs and its support of the terrorists in Syria. The ministry said field data and political and information reports, as well as the facts referred to by the Turkish parliamentarians and party's chairman, recently revealed the bulk of Turkish interference in the events in Syria. The ministry cited as examples the Turkish government's permission to 3 Saudi C-103 aircraft dedicated for military transportation and evacuation to use the Turkish airspace in order to deliver arms and equipment to the armed men in Syria. Turkey, the ministry added, has opened its airspace before President al-Assad stresses upon receiving a Turkish parliamentary delegation the need to separate between the stand of Turkish people and that of Erdogan government. The Foreign Ministry notifies the UN Security Council and the General Secretary of the Turkish involvement in supporting terrorists in Syria.